Thanks so much for coming out tonight for what is technically a meeting of my book discussion group. We just widened the group for this month's meeting. My name is Peter. I'm the assistant director here at the Abbot Library. So once again, thanks for coming out. Before we get started, thanks to our Friends of the Library group and our Board of Trustees, who are all really supportive and helpful in putting these kinds of events together. Also, thank you to Amanda Leslie, and of course, thank you to Jennifer Berkshire for being here tonight. We're really excited to have a discussion. I just wanted to let you all know about a few upcoming events here at the library. Next week on November 3rd from 1 to 6, we will have an open COVID vaccination clinic. I believe it's for the first series of shots as well as updates or boosters. And that's from 1 to 6, no appointment required. November 10, we'll have an online only seminar from Leslie Wooten, who will be talking about mental health and building a winter wellness toolbox as we head into the winter months. We do have more coming. Nothing that's solid yet, so I will keep my mouth shut about it. At the end of the night, we're going to have folks leave out this door. It can be a little dark right outside, but we'll try to get someone there to hold the door open so you can make it to the light. I will also pass around a clipboard if anyone wants to sign up for our mailing list, which will alert you to those fabulous future events. So we'll just start here since I think you guys won't need it so much. But with no further ado, Amanda's going to come up and make a couple more introductions.
So I wanted to start by thanking Peter and the library for running with this idea when I came and said, could we maybe do a book discussion of this? And he and Mindy were both like, yes, absolutely. And I also wanted to thank Jennifer for being willing to come and join us. If you aren't familiar with her beyond the book, she is not only the co-author with Jack Schneider, the Schoolhouse Drawer, but also a freelance journalist. She's the co-host of the education podcast, Have You Heard? She's an education advocate and an adjunct professor, currently teaching at Yale and often teaching at Boston College. And though she is from the Midwest, originally she lives in Massachusetts now. So thank you again, Jennifer, for being here. I met Jennifer this spring after my town education budget was slashed more than in half, as some of you maybe heard about. And we connected through that experience, which she took a great interest in and covered. So again, thank you for being here, and thank you to all of you for being here. For the discussion, I really wanted to ask that we could focus on the text and the questions that it raises, and to try to include as many people as possible. I think we have a couple of people online, so we would love to hear all of the questions and ideas that the text prompted for you. And before we get started with that, I am an English teacher at Kearsarge, and so I wanted to put on my teacher hat and ask that we take like 2 minutes to pause and reflect and gather our thoughts about, and possibly write if you want to do that, to think about what led you to the book, what you're hoping to gain through tonight's discussion of it, and the questions that you are bringing with you tonight. So if you want to jot those down, you can, and you just want to ponder for a moment. I'm going to pause and then have just a couple more things to share. Thank you. So before opening it up to questions, I wanted to invite Jennifer up to the podium to share some opening thoughts with all of you.
Thank you, Amanda. This is just so exciting. I am a little bit obsessed with New Hampshire now. I come here all the time, and the experience of getting to meet people in and around Croydon was just, particularly amazing. And I really do talk about it wherever I go. So I was in Atlanta a couple weekends ago, and somebody, I was on a panel, and somebody raised their hand and said, "This is just so bleak. Is there anything you can share to give us something to feel hopeful about?" And I was like, I've got it. But I think what's interesting is that, I paid attention to New Hampshire for quite a while. And what amazes me is just the experience of seeing people around the state really start to wake up to how vulnerable, not just your schools, but so many other institutions are here. And maybe a month or so ago, I got an email from a group of special ed teachers, and they wanted me to come this summer and be their professional development speaker. And I was like, really? Like, don't you want someone who's going to come and, help you think about special ed strategies? That's not really me. I'm like the gloom and doom guy. and they really laid it out for me. They said that more and more, when they hear the Commissioner of Education, Frank Aguilera, talk about his vision for the future, special education kids are not in it. The learn everywhere, the sort of the breaking up of the public school monopoly, those kids are nowhere to be found. And I thought, I've heard this vision before. I heard it coming from the architects of the budget cuts in Croydon. I heard them speaking very candidly and frankly shockingly about how many kids are just not educable. Mm-hmm. And that in the interest of freeing ourselves from the burden of taxes, we're going to free ourselves from the responsibility to educate the kids who need the most. And so the reason that I'm constantly directing people to New Hampshire is that I think in many ways, this is the future that a lot of, we see other states sort of coming up behind New Hampshire. And that's why it's so important and inspiring that we're able to point to a place like Croydon and to see that actually, people are able to come together. You think about the times right now, no one agrees on anything. And that people came together across party lines. People's minds were changed. Do you know how hard it is to change anyone's mind right now? And so to me, I feel like I have the most to learn from all of you about how that happened. So I'm hoping, I know Amanda has given us very strict instructions about remaining focused on the text, but I am hoping to learn more about how, how it was that sort of people remembered how essential public education is and convince their friends and neighbors of that. Because I sort of feel like we're all going to be in that position in the not too distant future. So Amanda, how do you want to do this sort of physically? Should we just turn our chairs this way?
And go more in the circle?
Yeah, let's do that.
Oh, I love that.
Does that still work for you, Ed, with the filming? If we just put our...
Whatever makes you all comfortable is fine by me. I'm here for the ride. I'm here for the ride.
It just felt a little...
As you were talking, I was feeling it.
Yeah, that's great. And Amanda, do you have an extra piece of paper?
Maybe I can.
Here. Here.
So you have it to lean on?
Yeah. And I'll give it back.
I'm sorry.
Am I in the way of your?
Not at all. Nope, I can move that. You don't need to feel like you're in the close-up area.
No, I know that. I just wasn't hoping to mark it.
Oh,
that's- That's much better.
Okay, I like it. So does somebody have a question right off the bat you wanna start us out with?
I have a question. Why didn't they sue them in Ohio? I lived in Ohio and I remember that ad campaign for that ECOT school system. And they booked millions, you said.
Yes.
Why didn't they get sued for fraud and the schools reimbursed? Because no offense, the schools in Ohio are god awful.
So we should give a little context for what we're talking about. So
That
So
was in
the-
your book.
Ohio is a really interesting example because powerful, particularly Republican politicians, realized that education could just be basically like an ATM. And so you saw them start to move into first to publicly funded religious schools, and then to charter schools, and then to online charter schools. And it became it was a just enormous scandal, in part because the schools, closed down very suddenly, thousands of kids, often really vulnerable kids. And then almost nothing came of it. Like no one paid.
Graduated, no one anything.
No one paid any price, and in fact, things have gotten quite a bit worse since we wrote that. So I don't have an answer for why I thought people would be madder about that. That I would think if something like that happened in a place like New Hampshire, that people would be outraged over the wasting of taxpayer money, but they didn't have the same response there.
No.
And it's kind of a mystery.
Yeah, it's always for kids.
Any feel-good questions?
The conclusion of your book, that's not a question, it's a statement. That's a feel good. Chris Prost put that last couple of sentences online today, and I wrote back, that's correct. Because the people didn't.
I think so we've, traveled around and done a million virtual events, and the single question we get that I think is the hardest to answer is people want to know, how can we get that? They feel like they live in a place where education has been completely redefined as an individual good, as a choice, and that they're, usually they're struggling with some way, how can we better advertise our school, right? But there's no language left to defend education as a public good, to talk about it in terms of the whole community. So one of the things, and obviously Croydon is unique because of the size, but in other ways, you have plenty in common with all kinds of different communities. So I think, I would love to know from people here how you succeeded in sort of getting, shaking people and waking them up and getting them to think about education as something that the whole town needed. And Hope, why don't we start with you?
I'm looking around at everybody. Excuse me. So, shock has a lot of power. No one expected that to happen except the people who did it. And I'm not even sure they expected it to succeed. Loss has a lot of power. I've lived in Croydon for 36 years, but my kids went to school in Sunapee, so we weren't personally vested in the village school. But I just kept hearing, and I keep hearing now. I went there, my kids went there, the legacy, Megan, you can
My kids are
speak to
fourth
that.
generation at our schoolhouse.
And so there was that power of, this is something extraordinary that should not be lost. quite frankly, I think if the pre-staters had made a motion to cut the budget $200,000, it would have passed and we would not be having these conversations about it. Because subtle change is more bearable, even though that would have had a very adverse impact. The school board would have figured out some way to operate in a somewhat, the way it usually had been with compromises. But that simply could not happen with a 53% budget cut. So it was shocking, it was a sense of loss. I think over time, it also, over the time of the campaign to revote, it also somewhat became a community thing to do, to be on board with restoring the school. It became a definition of the collective we.
I would agree. I think too, that it's not entirely transferable, which is sad. Like, I would like to say, okay, here's our program that we followed and let's send it out there. But I think to some degree it was uniquely about small town of Croydon, you know, and we really did call in small town connections and generational relationships that we could tap into in a different way than people facing huge budget cuts and attacks on public education could in a big city. You know, I don't think that they could have a campaign like we did. Maybe I'm wrong, but
I completely agree, because the Little Red Schoolhouse is part of the Croydon identity. So it's very much a part of who most of us are there. So it's not something that everybody would kind of miss that. That's part of the Croydon identity. So it's, you know, nobody wanted to see that go. Nobody did. And I think Croydon already had a format that most people really liked, the town tuitioning. From my perspective personally, I think we were content with that. The K through 4 worked. And then because obviously with 30 kids in the whole school, we had the option to go to whatever school fit our family best. You know, town tuitioning versus school choice. I think that was, for the most part, I think a lot of people in the community were content with that. But taking it a step further was something that nobody anticipated and wasn't part of the plan.
I think it's, you know, it's really interesting to see because it's a perfect example of how New Hampshire has been sort of ahead of the curve. So the idea that you would start to shift the burden of paying for education on to the consumers themselves is, you know, like people are sort of like, what? You know, like I'm gonna come up with $10,000 to send my kid to a public school. Like you really heard that coming through, and like when I interviewed Ed, or in some of in the This American Life episode, like that's people found that really shocking. Well, now you know I can point you to Republican candidates for governor around the country who are running on that platform. That's part of Mastriano's platform in Pennsylvania. That the money should go to wherever the parent wants it to go, but there should be less of it. And so I think that to me, what was really inspiring was to see that like when you actually present that idea to people, they do not like it. And that people were really able to articulate in sharp and clear ways why that was an unacceptable vision, and that represented something really different in their minds from the school choice vision.
On paper, it sounds like it's going to work out very well. That sounds great, but practically, no, it doesn't work. And my family, most of them are on the more conservative side. You know, once it looked like it was going to hit them square in the wallet, they were like, "Whoa, what's going on here? What do we do? You know, this normally doesn't affect, me, but now it looks like it's gonna affect my family, and I might have to pitch in to help send my grandkids to, public school. It was a huge wake-up call to a lot of people.
And we have an online comment from Chris. He said that in Croydon, we also had the ability to dig up a lot of things that the Underwoods had said in the past that showed just how extreme their agenda was, and that this was powerful in town since people saw their real views on education and how they weren't moderate.
That's very
I would say that is something very unique. And frankly thrilling from my perspective about the libertarians is they just love to talk. And so, because otherwise, you're so often left trying to, you're connecting the dots, like, well, this person once met with Betsy DeVos, so we can infer something from that. But they're just right out there. There's their podcast. Here's something that, Jody wrote 10 years ago that only the poorest kids should be entitled to public education, and we'll call it educate. And it's right there, right? Like we don't have to, and they're so blatant about the fact that is their end goal. So that I do think that was very helpful. But I have to say that the rest of the country is catching up to that. The visions that are being put forward are more and more extreme. And that's why you see the intensity of the culture war stuff. That a lot of these groups that are libertarian-ish, that have wanted for so long to get rid of the idea of taxpayer-funded public schools that you have to send your kids to, they see this as just a moment of enormous opening, and so that's when you see the school board meetings that are explosive, there's often somebody behind the scenes doing a little poking because they see it as an opportunity. Thanks, Chris.
So that kind of taps into one of my big questions, which was, this is a pretty new book published in 2020.
Paperback coming out in February.
But we are now almost at the end of 2022, and I was interested in what changes or updates you could offer. How do you think that the landscape you present in the book has shifted and or stayed consistent?
So we wrote a new preface, and I have to say that it was slightly on the grim side about the things that we couldn't have predicted. That it was going to press right as schools were shutting down, but like I couldn't have predicted the critical race theory backlash, or that suddenly we would spend all of our time talking about gender ideology, or I don't know if this is a thing in New Hampshire, but every day a politician pops up somewhere and insists that schools are putting litter boxes out.
I just read about that. Oh my God, I was laughing.
It never matters that it's there. It never they can never be documented. But it won't die. So like that's the sort of thing that if you asked me back then, like, will politicians be saying that schools are putting out litter boxes? I would say most likely not. But I think to me the real wake-up call was that just how the pandemic frayed what was left of any kind of bonds of solidarity that we had. And so you just felt people turning on each other at every level. And so if you lived in a big city, people were furious at the teachers' unions. But if you were in a place where there weren't teachers' unions, people were furious at the school board. And, there was so much to be mad about, often very justifiably so. And I think looking, now, the idea of public education is something that relies on some sense of solidarity. That I think to me is what makes it feel so vulnerable. So I would say that mostly my sense over those 2 years is darkened. But I would definitely say that I do feel that people are waking up.
I think the importance of your book is that you lay out the scope of this. All of us are aware of our local conflicts, but I truly had no idea that this has been so intentional for so long in so many places. And I think that's something that many of us need to think about, that this is really very serious.
So I completely agree, and I think it's so, it's so tempting to think of education as somehow this side issue, but I would really encourage you to connect it with all the other things that are happening. So almost every day if you're like me and the paper comes and you look at it and you think, oh, I don't know, can I really read it? There's, so much more politics right now is being driven by billionaires, often from the heartland, and often with grievances that date back decades. And you can just track down, there's a whole list of them. So like the DeVosses would be the most prominent, but there are others who really are barely household names, like the Ulines, who are in sort of Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, and they have made their fortune with cardboard boxes. So the last time you got a delivery, you probably opened a Uline box. Well, they fund every PAC you can think of that's, their interests are in things like dismantling public education, getting rid of taxes, and weakening democracy. And usually there's some, like the anger that motivates them goes way back. They feel like America went off the rails during the New Deal. That's when the unions got too much power, the administrative state got too strong. And somehow the things like Citizens United and the ability of wealthy people to spend virtually unlimited amounts of money in elections has had a huge impact, but somehow the pandemic and its long fallout has opened a door. And so that, it's the fact that they're like, for so many of them, getting rid of public education has been at the top of their list for a really long time, and now we're feeling it.
But didn't the pandemic point out the need for schools? So many kids did worse online. And we are lacking workers in this state, and you need educated workers. And I was always taught you educate your children so you have a future.
Yes.
Who's gonna take care of you?
Right.
Excellent question.
And everything else.
If they are educated.
Excellent question. And it's as inspiring as it is that you all were able to talk to friends and neighbors and change their minds. Shouldn't the business community be a little bit worried about we can look at states that have made the decision to spend less on their public education system, and we can watch their economic performance start to go like this for all of those reasons. If you don't have trained workers, it means you have to pay to basically import them. If you don't, or you have to pay to ship in jobs. And so the business community should be really alarmed by this stuff. And every once in a while you get the sense that they get that in New Hampshire, that they actually spoke out against the divisive concepts bill. But otherwise, I'm not sure they need to hear from you.
And if you extend that to higher education, kids who go to college out of state generally don't come back, or they don't come back for a decade or two, which means that the population gets older and needs the services that older people need. And the younger working folks aren't here to provide healthcare and road maintenance and all the things that we need.